Everything in this country is becoming third world. Nothing functions right anymore.
Good afternoon and welcome to Shadow of Truth with your host Dave Kranzler from investmentresearchdynamics.com and Rory Hall from thedailycoin.org. And we're very honored and privileged today to have returning guest Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who is one of the world's leading economists and probably America's greatest patriot. And without any further ado, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts.
Yesterday, the COMEX silver futures open interest hit just over 1 billion ounces, and most of that would be a naked short. And I guess my question is why is the Fed and the Treasury working as hard as they've ever worked to keep down the price of silver? And it's specifically silver. I mean, they're keeping down both gold and silver, but for some reason they seem to be working overtime on silver right now.
See, I don't have any idea. I saw what you had sent. I can't comprehend 1 billion ounces when I think you said there were only 50 million.
57 million of 57 million ounces that has been designated as available for delivery under those contracts.
So it makes no sense. I mean, 57 million that's an insignificant percent of 1 billion. And I don't understand. I don't understand how any regulatory authority can turn a blind eye to this.
Yeah, my argument to that was if 1% of the contracts, the over 200,000 contracts that are currently on the table, if 1% of that comes in, that's around 10 million ounces. If 2%, 20 million. So even it doesn't have to get to the 100%, 57 million for it to create major issues for the COMEX. So if only 1 or 2% of these contracts stand for delivery, we have a problem.
See, the question is, why does COMEX permit it?
Well, the COMEX is run by the banks. The CME owns the COMEX, but the COMEX is operated by the banks.
It's so blatant, though. I mean, it's.
Well, they know that historically in any given delivery month, no more than 1% of the contracts, and it's usually less than the contracts, ever stand for delivery. I mean, the COMEX is just purely a paper market. It's very little physical metal is ever exchanged on that market. But the amount of open interest on the COMEX is greater than the total amount of silver that's mined in a year by all mines globally.
Well, it's just a gambling mechanism then, so.
I mean, it doesn't. The COMEX, silver trading on the COMEX does not in any way represent any kind of real economic market or any kind of real price discovery market. And so I guess my question is, what is going on behind the scenes, do you think, that is causing the Fed and the Treasury to work harder than they've ever worked? And it's really illegal what they're doing.
I don't have any idea, but I don't even see how they can make any money on this. If it's 1 billion ounces short, there's not enough people in there to drive out.
That's a good point.
So what is it? It's just so nonsensical. I don't comprehend it. I have no idea. I don't want to say anything about it because it's incomprehensible. I mean, if they were shorting it in the kinds of things we've talked about, you can say, okay, they're driving people out. They'll be able to cover their shorts at a lower price. But I doubt there's a 1 billion ounces long. So how can you have if you go 1 billion ounces short, what's the long position there? I doubt it's 1 billion ounces. So how does this work for them? How do they make any money?
Well, the banks make money trading this. They trade in and out of this. They take on big short positions. The market drops. They cover the shorts. They're basically taking money from the hedge funds. And it's been going on for 15 years at least.
Is there 1 billion ounces they can take?
There's not, because these contracts, that 99% of the time they cash settle.
I know, but I'm just talking about if there's not 1 billion longs in there, how do they cover these shorts?
Well, there are 1 billion. The futures market is a zero-sum game. So for every contract bought, it's the same contract is shorted by someone. Do you see what I mean? So you short me a contract, and then at the end of the delivery period, or the end of the contract period, I decide whether I'm going to hold it for delivery, in which case you have to deliver me silver under the contract, or I decide to sell my long position, in which case I can roll it forward to the next contract period, or I can just sell it outright back to you and you cover your short. You cover the contract that you shorted to me. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but it seems to me like it's just too big of a short position to make any sense.
It is too big of a short position to make any sense, and other than there's a reason why they're trying to keep the price of silver down. Now, there's been rumors flowing fairly constantly out of London that there's the traders there are saying there's a possibility of a silver shortage at the refinery level by this fall. I mean, there's something wrong in the silver market, that this market is so out of balance like this, and that it's allowed to be this out of balance. I mean, there's never been any futures market in the history of the world that's been this out of balance in terms of the open interest versus the amount of underlying physical commodity that's available to deliver.
I would seem that to be the case, but I can't talk about this. This just blows my mind. We can talk something about the Trans-Pacific and the Transatlantic partnerships, because they do the same thing. And we can talk a bit about the Greece situation. I mean, what you're watching is the total failure of democracy. And it's the people's fault. It's the Greek people's fault. They're failing. So we can talk about those two things. I mean, the Greek debt's not payable. This is obvious, and I don't believe that the Germans don't know that, and that the EU doesn't know that, and that the European Central Bank doesn't know that. Everybody knows it's not payable, and so they continue the same stupid policy that everyone knows can't work. So there's another agenda going on there. It has nothing to do with Greeks paying their debt. So and all the austerity continues to worsen the problem because it drives the economy down. Every time they have a round of austerity, the economy drops further, so the debt rises as a percent of GDP. Well, that's an obvious failure. It doesn't work, but they persist. So we can talk about that. But
what do you see as Russia's role? Cyprus has met with Putin on 2 different occasions within the last 90 days.
Yeah.
And Putin came out and invited Greece to join the BRICS.
Yeah.
And what is your take on that? How is that going to fit into what's actually happening?
Well, if the Greek government had any sense, which apparently it doesn't have, it would simply default and accept the Russian deal and leave the EU, which means it would leave NATO, and this would begin the unraveling of NATO, and all the conflict would end. Because Spain and Italy would immediately follow. They're in the same position that Greece is in. They can't pay their debt. And they'll end up going through all this rigmarole and austerity and riots and protests, and it's pointless. And so clearly Cyprus is tired of being screwed over by the West and offered naval base to Russia. And Russia says, oh, great, because we don't know what's going to happen in Syria. That's their only naval base in the Mediterranean, is Tartus in Syria. And there's no telling what's going on there. And so they accept the Cyprus naval base. That's what I would do too. And they see that Greece is struggling and is being looted by its partners. And the Russians are saying, well, look, we won't loot you. Come join us. And that's what the Greeks should do. They should give the bird to the EU, say we completely default, you're not getting 1 cent. The hell with you. And we're out of NATO, we've got our own currency, and we're in league with the Russians.
Now, you mentioned
Within
Italy.
the week, Spain and Italy would follow.
Well, it is, you mentioned Italy,
Yeah.
and 3 days after the G7 summit in Bavaria, and I'm reading this, this comes by way of Investment Watch,
Mm-hmm.
and this gentleman found an Italian newspaper article where Russia has offered to Italy to join the BRICS as well. And this was on June 22nd when this happened, or when this article hit.
I'm glad the Russians are finally paying attention. That's a very good sign. They're finally paying attention, and they're going to do what they can to unwind the mechanism that Washington uses to bring conflict to Russia, which is NATO and the EU. And so that's good. That may save us from World War III.
Dr. Roberts, I wanted to circle back to something you said early on, and that is there's something else going on here, because it doesn't make sense for either side to still be at the negotiating table. And it seems like every week they redraw the line in the sand and set a new deadline. For instance, Merkel set Monday as a new deadline today. And I was discussing this with a colleague of mine this morning. If you break the situation down to its simplest components, essentially what you have is Greece. The Greece government is spending more money than it takes in. So it's even without the debt there, it's operating at an operating deficit. So even if the Troika were to extend more debt to Greece, which is what they'd have to do, they'd have to extend enough new debt so that they could become current on their current debt, but they'd also have to issue some more debt so that Greece could continue paying its operating expenses. And that's obviously why they want them to implement an austerity program. Now, from the politician's standpoint, I can see why Merkel would say, no, my taxpayers are tired of subsidizing your taxpayers. You guys need to get your expenses in line with your revenues. And from Greece's standpoint, I don't, like you said, it would make sense to go with Russia and just default on that debt. So the question is, why are both sides still at the negotiating table? There's something going on there that's
Look,
not obvious.
Merkel can't draw the deadline. The deadline is the date at which they have to make this payment to the IMF. And the IMF's policy is never to change the date. So that date is what, June the 30th?
June 30th, sure. But
so that's the deadline date. And all these other dates that people say are deadlines, that just may be them saying, we want it settled by then. We don't want it to go to June 30th or
okay,
whatever.
fair enough.
And so that's that. The austerity doesn't succeed because it drives the economy down. And as the economy is driven down, so are the government's revenues. And when the Troika makes them sell the state lottery, then they lose those revenues. And when things are privatized and taken out of the public sector, they lose those revenues. So the whole thing is designed to make it impossible for Greek to pay any debt or to balance his budget. I mean, the one thing we know from all economics since the 30s is that if an economy is in trouble and you impose austerity on it, it gets worse. You have to expand the consumer demand, the investment demand. Things have to go the other direction. But I see they've managed to drive down the Greek economy by 27%. So how in the hell can they pay anything or make anything balance? I mean, that's the trouble. The austerity is the trouble. It doesn't solve it. The debt, as we agreed, I think some time ago, should have been written down at the beginning of this crisis to the level that Greece could pay. That's the traditional solution. And they didn't do it because they have a different agenda. Here's what the agenda is. The creditors of Greece, their agenda is to establish the principle that they can overlend to a country and then force that country to privatize the public sector in order to raise money to pay the creditors. And they can force that country to cut back social services on the citizens, health, education, pensions, in order to pay back the banks. So it's an assertion that the creditor is above the sovereignty of the country, and therefore the country becomes subordinated to the creditor. So that is one agenda that's been operating. The other agenda that's operating is that the European Union and the European Central Bank are using the Greek crisis to establish the precedent that the budget and fiscal, that is the taxation, budget, the fiscal policy of EU members becomes the prerogative of the EU. That this is no longer something that is done at the member state level. It's set in Brussels. And the previous chairman of the European Central Bank, Trichet, he made this explicit, that this is the purpose, is to further solidify the control, the central control in the hands of the EU, away from the member states. And so that's what Greece is up against. It has nothing to do with the Greeks' ability to pay the debt. It has to do with those two agendas. And the Greeks should know that. Now, the trouble for the Greek government is that the Greek people didn't have enough judgment to give the government enough of a vote that they had any credibility when dealing with the creditors in the EU and the European Central Bank. A government that's only got 36% of the vote is not got a lot of credibility and has not been seen that way by the so-called Troika. And when the Greek people themselves say, well, we want you to get the debt negotiated down, but we want to stay in the EU. So as long as the Greek people are saying we want to stay in the EU, the government, the Greek government, hasn't any negotiating power. It can't say, you have to lessen this debt burden on us or we're going to leave, because the people have already said no, and if they leave, they'll be run out of office and another government will come in that will stay in. And so it's the inability of the Greek people to understand the situation and to give the government enough support that it can actually achieve something. And so, we can go blame the prime minister and the economics minister of the current government there, but they really just don't have enough support to have any clout. So that's the whole problem. Still, if I was this prime minister, I would just simply say, enough's enough. We're out. And I'd quickly sign some agreements with the Russians and let it go at that. And I think that the whole world would come to thank Greece, because I think it would begin the unraveling of the EU, which is a nonsensical organization in the first place. And with the unraveling of the EU would come the unraveling of NATO. And that means Washington would lose the mechanism that it has at its disposal to cause conflict with Russia. And this conflict is getting hotter And it's extremely dangerous. I mean, we've said before, Russia is not Libya, it's not Iraq. There's no prospect whatsoever of the NATO forces being able to attack Russia. They'd simply be wiped out instantly. And so the conflict would be nuclear, and the whole world would pay the price. So if the Greeks can save us this risk just by giving the finger to the Germans, to the EU, leaving, and making a deal with the Russians. In fact, they can say, look, there's more naval bases, air bases too. And I think a lot of people in Europe would get the message, and I think you would see Italy say, this is a good idea. We're tired of these Americans too. And the Spanish would say, well, what are we doing in the EU? They're going to drive us in the ground too. And probably then you would see the return of an independent foreign policy in France. France is the only one of the Western European nations during the post-war period that had an independent foreign policy. And they weren't in NATO. Remember, de Gaulle took them out in the 60s. And they only rejoined, I think, when was it, 2004, 2006? That France again becomes a member of NATO.
I think that's right.
So you would see the kind of change that would put the quietus in Washington trying to push Europe into conflict with Russia. It would just cease right there. And Washington can't do it on its own without NATO. So
let me ask you this question from a slightly different angle, given what you just said. And I think that's been some phenomenal insight. I mean, just to simplify the situation, if Greece is allowed to leave the EU, it's going to be a tipping point which will cause the entire EU to probably unravel. And it would also be a starting point to subvert the United States plans in Ukraine against Russia. Is that fair?
Right.
Okay, so...
Not just in Ukraine, but also in the Baltics, in Poland.
All of Eastern Europe. So do you think that behind the scenes, the United States is over there putting heavy pressure on the Troika to keep Greece in the EU?
If it's occurred to Washington, if it's occurred to them, they would leave, they would say, look, just print the money and pay off the debts. Look at all the money the Fed printed for the sake of 4 or 5 banks. Just trillions and trillions, right?
Yes. Yep.
So we do know that the EU Central Bank is already printing 60 billion euros a month. So just give some of those to pay off the Greek debt, or print some more. It doesn't seem to matter how much money they print. There's the consequences. Everything's so rigged, they can just print money. So that's what they should do. They should just print the money and pay off the debt.
And if they don't do that, Dr. Roberts, and say Greece doesn't leave the EU,
they'll be driven in the ground. This program can't work. So the Greek prime minister can fall on his sword. He can sign everything that the EU wants and the central bank wants, and he can agree, but it's not going to do any good. The economy is just going to drop further. The debt as a percentage of GDP will rise higher, and the situation is simply worsened. It's not corrected. It is impossible to correct the Greek situation with austerity. It simply cannot be done. And the logic of that approach is that nobody in Greece has any pensions, no health care, no education, there's no employment. That's the ultimate result of what the Troika is demanding, is that the Greek people are simply exterminated. They're not there anymore. There's nothing to sustain them.
Would China join in if the United States takes their game to fruition and attacks Russia? Would China join on? Would they support Russia?
Sure. Sure.
Wouldn't they?
Sure.
Wouldn't that in fact surround NATO at that point and the United States?
You have to understand the United States is in the hands of neoconservatives who are crazed ideologues. And they have this ideology that they're chosen by history to impose American will on the world. They're crazier than Adolf Hitler. And they run the United States foreign policy. They are the National Security Advisor to Obama. They are the American ambassador to the UN. They are the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the Ukrainian part of the world. It just goes on and on and on. They're all over the Defense Department. And so, and they think they can win a nuclear war. So the whole thing is extremely dangerous. Americans are so uninformed because they haven't got a media. They haven't any real comprehension of the extent of the risk. And when Washington keeps putting all this pressure on Russia and on China, this pivot to Asia, all the new naval and air bases to ring in China and essentially give the United States control over the South China Sea. China can't stand for that.
They've made that very clear.
Yeah, even more than Russia can stand for Ukraine to be in NATO. So this type of recklessness is unprecedented in history.
Dr. Roberts, I know you're pressed for time here, and so far this has been an incredible conversation. I wanted to just shift gears here a little bit to the TPP agreement, and I hadn't spent a lot of time on it until the fast track authority was granted by Congress. And the reason is I was naively hoping that Congress would shoot down giving Obama the fast track authority. But as it turns out, the resistance in both houses was just kabuki theater, and the right senators and congressmen were waiting with open hands for enough cash to be sprinkled around by the multinational corporations so that they would in fact give Obama fast track authority. And that authority gives Obama the ability to negotiate any part of the agreement outside of congressional oversight. And when I did some research on this last night, what I found is quite horrifying. And just to put it simply, this TPP agreement essentially usurps the U.S. Constitution, because it creates a body of laws that exist among the signatories to the agreement that are enforceable over and above any of the sovereign laws of any of the countries who are signatories to the agreement. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, what it does, more generally, it's not just the United States. What these transatlantic, trans-Pacific so-called partnerships do is they give transnational corporations immunity to the sovereign law of the countries in which they operate. Anytime the corporation can argue that the sovereign law of a country is a restraint on trade. So, for example, the French have laws against GMOs, genetically modified organisms, either as seeds or foods. And Monsanto, if this agreement is signed, Monsanto can then sue the French government for restraint on trade. So anything that a corporation can represent as a restraint on trade becomes a dead letter law of that country. I think they can even apply this to the income tax, the corporate income tax, because they can say, well, it raises the cost of business as a restraint on trade. So the whole purpose of these partnerships is to make transnational corporations, global corporations, independent of all law in all the countries in which they operate. I'm not sure this means they could go in and kill people, because I don't know how they would be able to argue that the people were a restraint on trade. But any sort of regulatory measure having to do with health standards, safety standards, any of this type of thing can be represented as a restraint on trade. I gave you the example of Monsanto and GMOs. So that's what this does. And a lot of people say, oh, it lets other countries have power over us. Well, it lets corporations have power, or insulates corporations from the power of all governments, so that the traditional kinds of regulation are no longer possible.
It's absurd.
Well, that's what it does. And of course, the corporations wrote it.
What do you make of this fact that anyone who knows what's in the agreement itself, who discloses the details of the agreement, can be thrown in jail?
Well, it shows you that they're determined that nobody knows in democracies, that nobody dares knows what's being enacted. And you see, they get away with, Congress is supposed to make the laws. But when they call this a treaty, they can say, oh, this is not a Congress. Treaty is something the executive branch does. And so you see here is deception on many fronts, because this is not a treaty. This is the saying it's a treaty is cover so that the executive branch or the private corporations acting through the executive branch can write the laws and not the legislatures of the countries. So it's a total subversion of democracy and of accountability. And so when people say we already live in a police state, it's quite clear. But it's not just us. It's all of Western Europe. It's Canada. It's Australia. You have the same thing happening in Japan. No one in Japan is allowed to actually address the real situation with Fukushima. You can't. The news organizations are not permitted to report the extent of the catastrophe, the fact that it is not dealt with, can't be dealt with, that the pollution is outpouring. There's even the possibility the entirety of Tokyo would have to be evacuated. But there can't be any discussion of this, so there's just generally no awareness. This is increasingly everywhere, and I just read, and I haven't had a chance to check if this could possibly be true, but the United States military has now redefined war correspondents or journalists in war zones as something that can be an unprivileged belligerent. Apparently, an unprivileged belligerent who's a journalist. It's a journalist who is not telling the side of the story that the United States military thinks should be told. And so you can see this effort to protect itself from information, because the information would contain the truth. That this is now, it seems to be the main commitment of the United States government, is to protect itself against truth by declaring purveyors of truth to be enemies or unprivileged belligerents or whatever. And this is a common practice, as I say. You can see it everywhere. You can see it in Japan. You can see it in the EU. So when we talk about authoritarianism in China and Russia, the democracy there is far advanced compared to what remains in the West.
It's just incredible what's occurred in this country, not just since really since Watergate, but especially in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, it seems to be the complete totalitarian control by the government. It seems to be accelerating now, and it's amazing how oblivious the public is to it.
Right. That's right. That's exactly the case.
Well, Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for your time. You've been really generous. This has been an incredible conversation. Rory, do you have anything else to add?
Just I appreciate all your time, Dr. Roberts, and I appreciate all your efforts in keeping us informed, because you are one of the few voices of reason out there, and it's greatly appreciated, and I hold you in the highest of respect.
Well, thank you, Rory, and I always enjoy speaking to you and Dave. It's really a pleasure, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Likewise, Dr. Roberts. One thing I'd be remiss if I don't add this in there, and that is John Embry wanted me to pass on to you that he has great admiration for your work, and he considers you one of the true brave patriots in this country.
Well, you thank him very much. That is very kind.
Will do.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, and you have a great afternoon.
Thank you. So long.